Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of 15 Minutes of Flame. I'm your host, Sarah Levy, and today we're going to be talking about wildfires. For those listeners out there who have had the privilege of growing up basically anywhere except for the Western United States, let me provide a little insight on what growing up surrounded by wildfires looked like for us West Coast kiddos. Here in the West, instead of snow days, we have fire days. It's difficult to imagine that most people listening in this morning have never heard of a concept known as snow days. But, in case you haven't, a snow day is basically a day in which schools or other large institutions are closed as a result of heavy snowfall or other forms of extreme winter weather. Growing up in Southern California, I always envied the kids who grew up in the places where winter weather meant waking up on a random Wednesday in the middle of January to the melodic sound of the weather reporter's voice announcing that schools were canceled for the day due to the heavy snowstorm that rolled in overnight. Snow days for me only existed within my far-off imagination. Coming from Cali came with a different form of unplanned days off from school. Fire days stormed in just as quickly as snow would, yet lacked any form of grace or beauty. These occurred when schools would close as a result of a raging wildfire in the nearby area that was spreading so rapidly and was producing so much smoke that it was deemed unsafe to spend the entire day at school. With fire days came never-ending hours of watching the local news station, waiting for your neighborhood to be ordered to evacuate, praying that it wouldn't. I can remember countless times when evacuations were mandatory, standing in my bedroom with a singular backpack, trying to figure out which of the belongings of mine were worth taking and which of those could be left behind with the slim chance that I might never return back to them. These were the days off from school that I grew up with, but it didn't always used to be this way. Since the turn of the 21st century, the frequency and intensity of wildfires has increased exponentially in the Western United States, causing an ecological crisis that is deemed to only worsen as time progresses. But we seem to forget that fire has been present since the rise of human societies, beginning with indigenous practices of prescribed burning to the combustion of fossil fuels. It is only recently that our view towards fire in the landscape has been tainted, that we've begun to fear forest fires. From our fears, we neglect to consider the need for fire in sustaining biodiversity and ecosystem health. As our perception of wildfire has changed over the course of the past 3 decades, we've become a world that politicizes Mother Nature, placing a vast amount of blame on climate change without realizing how global temperature rise results from human causes. While fires are necessary for healthy forests, our attitude towards wildfire have been dramatically altered over the last 30 years, and we've started to view fire suppression as the only management tactic. In 1994, the tone and diction used to describe wildfires in the western United States was leisurely and nonchalant, reflecting society's understanding that forest fires were a natural phenomenon necessary in keeping fuel loads low and helping with the reproduction of several tree species. Examining a specific fire surrounding Ute Creek in Meeker, Colorado, I had the opportunity to learn about the events from journalist Ray Ring, writer for High Country News. Ring recounted how the smoke was lazy and graceful and the fire fairly quiet. In his words, we can feel the sense of casualty that surrounded wildfire management at the time. Fires were blocked simply to prevent flames from advancing onto private property in an attempt to salvage someone's land. Once it was guaranteed that the fire wouldn't be in harm's way, firemen were sent elsewhere. Ring calls this policy suppression by confinement, which served as a laid-back response to a process that alters the environment quite significantly. After reading Ring's work, I had assumed that the ways in which wildfire management was spoken of 30 years ago demonstrated the acceptance of fire as part of a natural, healthy ecosystem taking place in a simpler moment in history. But other pieces of evidence seem to suggest otherwise. In September 1996, 2 years following Ring's article, the New York Times published a piece written by James Brooke titled "Huge Western Wildfires Spur Debate on Controls." The article's focus surrounded the fact that wildfires in the western United States were becoming more dangerous and destructive and more expensive to suppress. Of the many individual fires that took place that year, many were notable by their 250-foot flames, which reached temperatures as high as 2,000 degrees. The consequence of these extremities, Brooke explained, was the destruction of seeds and the sterilization of soil that had been charred by the burns. While many people, myself included, thought that the raging wildfires that we see today weren't a threat 30 years ago, this article proves otherwise. Since the end of World War II, the Smokey the Bear ethic has been religiously followed, and fire suppression has been deemed a national goal. The issue that arises from this, then, is the way that fire suppression management tactics impact the biodiversity of forests. Whereas forests that were maintained by native peoples used to have small, frequent fires that cleared out leaf litter and small shrubs that are known to easily ignite, forests under federal management have lots of small trees as a result of fire suppression and logging. Both of these things make it far easier for low-lying shrubs to catch fire and transform into large-scale wildfires within a matter of minutes. As the news article reveals, the increase in wildfires and the sense of urgency to find alternative methods of fire management arose prior to the turn of the century. The discrepancy between the way that Ring discussed wildfires in High Country News and the approach taken by Brooke in the New York Times shows how different parts of the country were perceiving fire management at the time. But what can be understood from both journalists is that as humans have continued to further encroach on wild woodlands, management practices have continued to drastically change, and oftentimes not for the better. During the early 2000s, viewing fire in the landscape as a threat to both human and endangered species populations was furthered as scientists started drawing connections between climate change and human activity. Data collected in 2004 revealed that national forests were in danger of experiencing increased wildfires because of heightened invasive weed growth. Bigger fires cause greater weed invasions, which would create a positive feedback loop, speeding up the fire cycle by providing more fuel for future fires. Michelle Nijhuis, who also writes for High Country News, wrote an article on this phenomenon. From her work, I learned about several studies that were conducted to analyze wildfire history in order to see how wildfires will increase in both regularity and destruction as global temperatures begin to rise. The sobering conclusion that was made is based off of the best case or least dramatic climate change scenario, and emphasizes that the greatest impact from wildfires will occur in the hottest and driest locations. This shift that we see from a biocentric outlook to a more climate change focused one is a recent depiction that expresses a sense of urgency in solving an upcoming ecological crisis. Management practices are hastily being developed to save human life from these disastrous burns, with little, if any, regard for the animal and plant lives that will also be greatly impacted. Unfortunately, this neglect of non-human lives will ultimately lead humans to suffer too. Reformist ideas of wildfire management today are held in frequent opposition to right-wing policies, causing these environmental issues to transition into political ones. A consequence of this polarization is what journalist Ruxandra Giddy calls a year-round fire season. Fires today are burning for twice as long as they did 30 years ago, yet these burns are of our own making, caused by increased development of fire-prone areas and forestry practices that continue to suppress natural fires. An article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America provides a detailed explanation as to how humans have altered what the authors of the text term the fire regime. These scientists define a fire regime as dominated by either human or lightning ignitions, when one cause accounts for more than 80% of the number of fires within an area of approximately 100 square kilometers. Humans primarily impact fire regimes by changing the distribution of ignitions, shifting the seasonality of burning, and impacting the amount of fuel available to sustain the burns. According to this same study, humans have affected the spatial fire niche in the U.S. by accounting for up to 84% of wildfires and 44% of total areas burned. Regardless of how much government funding goes into fighting these excessive burns, human-caused climate change has exacerbated the issue at hand. Anthropogenic climate change is linked to increased fire frequency and size and longer fire season because it introduces ignitions into landscapes with dry enough fuels to ignite and carry fire. Some of these ignitions include road networks, wild and urban interfaces, and boundaries between agricultural and forested areas. As a result, it is much more challenging for individuals to see eye to eye when attempting to develop new management strategies. The diction used to describe these catastrophes evokes an apocalyptic feeling as well, making it seem like the clock is ticking and time is running out. Wildfire is no longer perceived as a necessity, but as a calamity, and the heightened debate about its management at the federal level has increased public anxiety and fears pertaining to the future. To prevent the ongoing politicization of Mother Nature and return to a mindset focused on sustaining biodiversity, we must educate ourselves and advocate for forestry management practices that benefit both humans and all other life forms, plants and animals alike. It is not enough to sympathize with the environmental movement, yet refuse to act on those emotions. An increase in public awareness and a policy focused on wildfire management, especially during the times of heightened fire risk associated with climatic irregularities, are necessary to reduce the amount of human-provoked fires. As the National Academy of Sciences has observed, national policies can strongly influence fire regimes, and with sufficient information on human ignitions, policy directives could target human behavior in ways that remediate increasing trends of wildfire risk. The crisis that the Western United States is currently facing is one that requires direct involvement from all Americans, and will gain momentum from the bottom up if people are willing to unite under the many principles, including justice, equity, nurturing, and prosperity, that we all aspire to achieve. We must look out for one another and look out for ourselves. Do we really want our children and our children's children to have to dread fire days off from school in the ways that we have? Extending our communal values to the environment will ultimately benefit the world as a whole.